All right. First of all, thank you for inviting me. Great endeavor. First of all, I'm an economist, and so nothing so exciting that you just heard, you will hear from me. So just I'm setting the expectations. The second thing is that I was asked to talk about the, no, that's not, I was asked to talk about the future of the labor market. And basically I asked, why am I talking about the future of the labor market in the education conference? And they said, well, you know, that's what we're sort of doing. We're preparing people for the labor market, which is not something that I've ever heard from the teachers of my 3 kids. They denied that connection vehemently. I mean, they were not at all willing to accept that they were actually preparing children for the labor market. So, by the way, Rotem, I think you should give marital advice. Because now I understand with this Bayesian brain, now I understand how to communicate with my wife, which is, should just agree that we see the world differently. It's a bit scary that I'm going to, based on these 2 last lectures, I'm envisioning the future labor market populated with the kids who are easily bored, attention span of about a goldfish, and each one living in their own reality. So that's how we're going to be preparing for the labor market. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'm going to talk about the future labor market. You cannot understand it without understanding where the world is going. And it's basically explained we're not in Kansas anymore. There are 5 trends that I've presented. The first time I presented this slide to the government of Israel in 2013, basically setting up a narrative of what is going to drive our reality, economic reality. I was talking about mostly economics, but societal reality. There are 5 things. Post-crisis world, I'm not going to bore you with the details of economic jargon, but basically never in human history, we saw such low interest rates, such low inflation, low growth, and such a high debt in these economies, at least in the developed world economies. And so we have no idea how to get out of this because we've never seen it before, because we, as Sagi suggested, that we should look for the data. We don't have data for this. Second part is aging population. This is like a tsunami, except that it's coming towards us very slowly, but you can see it. So today Japan has over 25% of people over 65, and they're going, and the total population is shrinking. The percentages of people over 65 is going up, and this changes basically everything in our world. So we're going to have to actually work much harder in order to sustain ourselves for a much longer periods of time that we have to sustain ourselves when we retire. The third thing is that the center of economic gravity shifts around the world. There's a very nice graph that shows that the center of economic gravity of the world started in the Middle East. Then it moved towards China and India, then it moved all the way back into the middle of Atlantic, and then now it came back to the Middle East, not because the Middle East is the center of gravity, but because it's right in the middle of the West and the East. So this is something that the biggest part of that change is that we suddenly creating enormous number of people that are moving from poverty into middle class. We're talking about hundreds of millions. So over the last 15 years, 500 million people in China alone moved from poverty to middle class. This is more than, of course, than the entire Europe. So that means that these people are going to compete with all of us for resources because they want to eat like middle class, dress like middle class, have houses like middle class, and drive cars like middle class. So, and of course, travel. So this is something that is creating, again, a new situation which we are not accustomed to. And of course, climate change, I'm not going to bore you, but the biggest part of the climate change is actually the uncertainty that it brings. And then the final part is that the world learned how to collect and analyze enormous amounts of data, enormous, unimaginable, even 20 years ago, amounts of data at unimaginable speeds. So we're basically replacing people's muscles. We used to be replacing people's muscles with technology. Now we're replacing people's senses and people's brains Okay, so this is the biggest part. And so the part is all these technologies that are written there, they basically contribute to all these changes. And the basic insight that I'm taking out of this is that in the past, technology was replacing muscle, and therefore it had very high marginal cost, meaning that for any additional unit of technology, you had to spend a lot of money, and it was rising. So what that means is that at some point you didn't want to use any more technology and you wanted to use people, because think about ATM, okay, versus teller. You know, for large markets you want to use ATM, for small markets tellers would be better because ATM is too expensive. There is a shift from agriculture to manufacturing and services, and there is slow and somewhat predictable process of change. All that have changed, none of that is relevant anymore. We are facing huge economies of scale. What economies of scale means that with a single code, you can service basically any number of people. You know, the only thing that stops you, the marginal cost, is the amount of energy that code takes on your computer, which is trivial. Okay, so that basically says that we're no longer in the world where we can stop at some point replacing human brains. We can replace all of them in certain activity with one software, once we developed it. The shift is no longer, we're not going to shift from services back to agriculture and manufacturing. That's not going to happen. So we are shifting within services. And within services, we're shifting from the ones that are easily replaceable by computer to the ones that cannot be replaced by computer, except that there are two types of those. One type is like giving people haircuts, which is not particularly difficult, depending on your hair, of course, but not particularly difficult task, or cleaning houses, etc., versus actually taking care of computers and writing that code. So there's a huge diversion between these. So the world is very, very different, and people that say, well, you know, people always had technological progress. We're not there. And so basically what that means is that people, corporations, and governments have to understand that we're in the new equilibrium. We're in a world of a continuous, rapid, unpredictable change all the time. Okay? And by the way, for that matter, it's scary to have these kids with very, very small attention span, but maybe this is exactly the type of population that we need to actually cope with this continuous technological change. And so the question is, maybe we should get used to this, and because the continuous change is no longer creating an equilibrium. Things do not change and then stabilize. They change and then change and then change. And so this is almost a disequilibrium, so we have to reinvent, in some sense, economic sciences and all kinds of social sciences, because disequilibrium is a new concept for all of us. This actually leads us to a variety of social outcomes. I use this graph to show that we actually no longer have one economy, and Israel is the most striking example of this, because in Israel, this Zeppelin economy, which is the technological economy, these are the people who are basically pushing the boundaries all over the world, is the largest in percentage terms in the world. 9% of the workforce in Israel works in that Zeppelin, and it generates between 12 and 15% of GDP. There's no other country that does that, at least that I know of. And then there is the rest of the economy, which is still the legacy systems, which are much more slow, much less productive, etc. So there's an interesting thing between these two economies, is that they're basically not connected. They have very, very little connection between types of skills they need, types of financing they need, types of regulation, knowledge, and markets. So in Israel, this Zeppelin economy, basically international, completely international, and the local economy is very much local. And they are not meeting each other. And another interesting feature of this Zeppelin economy is that it is easily movable. If you cut a few ropes, you can move that Zeppelin to another place, and that's something that a lot of countries want, that Zeppelin. So lots of countries are trying to move it towards them. This is a graph showing that the Zeppelin economy in Israel looks pretty good. I'm not going to talk too much about it. It's just, just one number to give you, is that we have the highest number of startups per capita, and we have the basically over twice the amount of VC capital per capita in the United States, which is much higher than anybody else after that, which implies that it's a very, very dense innovation ecosystem. But the side effect of this is the following, okay, that the average in OECD of the wages in the Zeppelin economy versus the wages downstairs are about 50% higher. In Israel, they're 150% higher, and the difference is growing. Okay, this is a lesson that we have to understand. And this lesson is multiplied in these four different events. So the first thing is that the growth in inequality is not a bug. It's a feature of this growing technological economy and its impact on the labor force. Okay, that's not going to go away. The second thing is that today, most of economic models that I know of have embedded sort of stoppage or break to how many people you need in the economy, and so the unemployment is never massive in these models. But if your computer program can replace infinite number of people in various tasks, it can actually, many computer programs can replace so many people that we may have redundancies. Because maybe we don't need to produce all of the consumption that we want. Maybe we can produce it with 1/3 of people that exist today. I mean, nobody planned the number of people and the amount of consumption together. They were sort of two separate two separate processes. And so whether there's going to be massive unemployment or every second person will be a yoga teacher, that's a question. We don't know the answer to that, but there's definitely possibility. The problem is with this increasing inequality is that traditional redistribution tools do not really work, because you can no longer take capital and skilled labor and tax them heavily in order to transfer the wealth to others who are less fortunate and not in the Zeppelin economy, for a very simple reason that the Zeppelin economy can move. People individually, companies, and the entire ecosystem. And if you lose too many companies and too many people, you're going to have all these wonderful stories being told in Berlin or in Singapore or elsewhere, and not in this country. So there's a big limit on this. Therefore, I go back to the growing inequality as a feature. And finally, governments, if there are government officials here, of course you are not in that category, are very ill-equipped to deal with change and innovation for a very simple reason that we demand from governments accountability. We demand from governments fit and proper. We do not demand from them innovation. And innovation is hard because innovation implies that you have to try and err and say, well, I actually screwed up because this was intended. That's what startups do. Governments don't deal well with that because the incentive system is not there. So where do we look for solutions? Well, it's actually here. It's actually the only solutions to make people actually be comfortable with change, easily adaptable to the changing conditions, able to learn throughout their lives and not be bored with learning, because if they have attention span of 5 minutes, that will not be a good learning experience. And you're the ones that are going to make it happen. So good luck.